Bill McKibben is an author whose 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change. He's also the founder of 350.org, the first planet-wide grassroots climate change movement. He is widely recognized and decorated as one of the most important environmentalists and climate change activists in the world, receiving multiple prizes and accolades throughout his career, including the Gandhi Prize in 2013 and the Thomas Merton Prize, among many others. He continues to write about the climate for multiple publications, including the New York Review of Books, National Geographic, and Rolling Stone. Welcome to the Soapbox, Bill McKibben.
Pleasure to be with you, Eric.
Okay, Bill, I wanted to start, this is a very sort of big question, but can you give us a sense of just how bad is the problem that we are facing as a species, as a planet, when it comes to climate change?
Well, I'd say it's the biggest problem we've faced yet as a species, because we've never really managed to do anything that affected the whole Earth all at once. But that's what we're doing now. As you know, temperatures have begun to rise because of the carbon we've put in the atmosphere. And that rise, only about 1 degree Celsius so far, has already been enough to cause really quite astonishing consequences. The rapid melt of sea ice in the summer Arctic, for instance, or the, as we learned this year, the irreversibility of melt on the West Antarctic ice sheet, or the steady acidification of the waters of what, after all, is an ocean planet, or the strange and increasingly fraught changes in continental weather as we see more and more drought and more flood, both things scientists warned us to expect simply because warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's what we've done with a degree increase in temperature. The biggest trouble ahead is that we're on a course to increase the temperature probably 4 degrees or 5 degrees before this century is out. And if we do that, then really we can't have civilizations of the kind that we're used to having. The only thing on a kind of similar scale that human beings have even contemplated is the effect of all-out nuclear war. But we were able to imagine that pretty well, Eric, what that would look like, those huge explosions sort of seared into our brains by movies and by the images from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So much harder for us to realize that you could have 1 billion tiny explosions of 1 billion pistons and 1 billion cylinders every minute across the globe, and that could wreak the same scale of damage. But it can, and in this case, it very much is.
So I think I want to spend some time, the little time that we have together today, sort of addressing the systemic challenges that our political and economic systems pose to the problem of climate change. And let me start with this. Given that something like 97 or 98% of scientists agree that climate change is a grave threat facing our species and the planet, and the majority of the population agrees with this, although I think the number has been going down lately. Why is it that Congress, who ostensibly are there to represent the interests of the citizens, is so full of such vocal climate change deniers? How is it that has come to be?
I bet you could almost answer that question yourself. And I bet, not to be cynical, but I bet basically everyone listening in could answer that question for themselves. The biggest single players in our campaign finance game here and in many other places around the world are the fossil fuel industry. In the last election, they spent about $750 million, and they get a tremendous return on that investment. The U.S. Congress is one of the few places in the world where you can command a majority of people to ignore science and go ahead and stick with the current course. That's what happens when you have a democracy for sale. And the biggest buyers are the richest people on Earth. The fossil fuel industry is by far the most profitable business that human beings have ever engaged in.
So given that, say, capitalism, by its very nature, is reliant on consumption and endless expansion, and we know that those are drivers behind the threat that climate change poses, or the very dire threat that it poses, and given the degree to which capitalism is entrenched around the globe, should any environmental movement with a legitimate hope of success be significantly focused on transitioning our global society away from capitalism to a less destructive alternative, and what might that look like?
Well, look, I'm not a very good ideological thinker, and I don't really think in terms of, what the whole world's got to look like. In fact, I think that kind of the insight of ecology is that one of the problems with the world we've built is that we've tried to make it look the same everywhere, even though everywhere isn't the same. I think that the most constructive, concrete, and subversive thing one can do about our economic system right at the moment is try and change the most fundamental thing about it, which is where it draws its energy from. I think it's worth remembering that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations after James Watt invented the steam engine and not before. It was that access to fossil fuel that turned us into modern human beings, including human beings who hold this series of ideological beliefs. So I think the task at the moment, not just, it's demanded by physics and chemistry, is to move us toward renewable energy. And I think that as we do, we can't help but upset the balances of political and economic power in this world. Think about it. I mean, at the moment, the richest people in the world are those who happen to sit on little piles of coal or gas or oil. These are concentrated in a few places. The sun and the wind and the tide are just the opposite. They shine and blow and roll in every corner of the world. And so if we are using those as the bases of our economies will look different, more decentralized, more democratic. To me, maybe some listener of yours has some grand plan for how one goes about overturning the entire thing all at once, and then after we've done that, then we'll address climate change or something. But to me, given the short window of time we've got to work in, to me it seems tactical to go after the power basis of the 1% and the physical power basis.
And so what does that look like, Bill? How do we approach...
So, I mean, our approach at 350.org has been, well, in part it's been to play defense against every bad project, fossil fuel project that comes along, every new idea to get yet more hydrocarbons when we already have far more coal and gas and oil in our reserves than we can burn. And so we fight pipelines. We were so moved by the fight of people all across Maine and especially in South Portland to stop that tar sands pipeline down through New England. Mm-hmm. Of course, we work on, it's like the Keystone Pipeline. We work on coal ports in the Pacific Northwest. We're hard at work with lots of people getting arrested in Australia, blocking the world's largest coal mine, on fracking fights the world over. We're so pleased in this end of 2014 that Governor Cuomo in New York was forced to stop fracking in the Empire State. We play defense and we play offense. And we play offense, I think, primarily with this rapidly spreading and very important divestment campaign to get our institutions to cut their ties with this rogue industry, this industry that has 5 times more carbon in its reserves than any scientist thinks we can safely burn. The very first college, really, I think the very first institution in the world to do that was Unity College in Maine. And from that quite small but beautiful seed, much has spread. Institutions like Stanford or Australia's National University or Glasgow in the UK, or most astonishingly in September, the Rockefeller family, all announcing that they were cutting their ties with fossil fuel. It's been remarkable to see that happen, and a way to weaken the political power of this industry. We can't bankrupt them, but we probably can politically bankrupt them. At least that's what history suggests from examples like the fight against apartheid a generation ago.
And so is that what it comes down to, Bill, is making a moral argument? Is that going to ultimately be successful in terms of prying these people away from these profit-making ventures of theirs that are essentially based on fossil fuels and dirty energy?
No, I don't think one's likely to persuade them morally. I think that there's a series of policies that we need. For instance, every economist, left, right, and center, has said for years that we need a price on carbon. But we don't have one because of the incredible political power of the fossil fuel industry. If we're going to get common sense solutions like that in place, we're going to need to break that political power. And that's what happens when institutions say they'll no longer participate in this particular charade.
And how do we persuade those institutions?
If you belong to anything that has some money, then you need to go to work. Now, some of your listeners, some of their institutions have already done the right thing. If you're a Unitarian or a member of the United Church of Christ, then those two denominations have made it clear they don't want to be invested in fossil fuel. But perhaps maybe you went to college and you're the alumna of a university someplace. You may have noticed that your university retains an interest in you and sends you a envelope this time of year, every year. You need to point out that the science and the ethics you learned while you were at college mean that you want very much for the institution which you're proud and hold an allegiance to be a leader in the most important fight humans have ever been engaged in. The same with city councils and state pension funds, which are beginning to join this divestment fight as well. We need people working on this at every level. There's lots of information at gofossilfree.org.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this, taking it back down to sort of an immediate practical level, there does seem to be a certain element of privilege or a perception of privilege when it comes to going green. So, for example, people on fixed incomes can't afford to get an electric car, or they may not have the ability to either afford shopping at a local co-op or even have one around. They might live in a rural area and they need to commute to work to be able to live. So what do you say to the people who maybe sympathize intellectually with the environmental movement but feel practically that they're sort of left out of the loop due to socioeconomic or class limitations?
Yeah, personally, I don't think that any of that individual change is really at the heart of what we're talking about. I mean, I've got solar panels all over my roof because if I wasn't going to do it, who was, But I don't try to fool myself that that's stopping climate change. This is a systemic, structural problem. It'll be solved, if it's ever going to be solved, by systemic, structural responses. That means organizing. That means political engagement, and that's something, happily, that people of all kinds can and do engage in. The climate movement is increasingly led by people in the kind of communities you describe. When 400,000 people came to march in New York City in September, the biggest demonstration about anything in this country in quite a while, the first ranks of that great parade were all people from indigenous communities and people from frontline poor communities around the United States who have to deal with the effects of fossil fuel. Now, they were followed by lots of students and scientists and trade unionists and people of faith and all, but it was a very vibrant, diverse crowd in every way, as is this fossil fuel resistance that's sprung up around the world. So, no excuses for anyone. If you're a good citizen, then you'll be involved in this fight.
So, is that something that you're seeing take shape? Is a movement away from the perception that to be involved in this fight, to take to the streets, you need to be some sort of radical? Are you seeing more people, just average working people, understanding that this is in their interest, to their benefit, to get involved?
Yeah, no, look, anyone who's capable of following the news, or anyone who's capable of poking their head out the window every so often and seeing what's happened to the weather, understands that this is the fight of our lives. And of course, there's nothing radical about it at all. In fact, if you think about it, it's really quite a conservative demand that the world be allowed to stay in its orbit, that we keep something like the climate system that human beings have always known for the 10,000 years of recorded human history. That period, the Holocene, the scientists call it, is coming to an end now. We've made it too warm. The only question is how far out of the Holocene we're going to go. And so demanding that we keep the temperature within a reasonable level is, if you think about it, very conservative. Radicals work at oil companies. If you're willing to get up in the morning and make your fortune by altering the chemistry of the atmosphere, and you're willing to do it even after the Arctic has melted and the oceans have acidified, then you're a radical on a scale we've never seen before. You make those guys from the 60s in their long hair and things look like amateurs. I mean, that's radical.
So I think that there's also there are some people around the world, particularly in America, I think, that have this faith in science, and they see sort of sacrifice as inconvenient, but they're sort of placing all of their cards in geoengineering or solar radiation management or some sort of magical science solution to this problem. What would you say to those people? Is that going to be part of it, or is it as simple as we need to learn to be able to sacrifice?
You got to have, if you have faith in science, you better listen to what the scientists are telling you, which is get the heck off fossil fuel. I don't think it's, I'm not even sure sacrifice is where we're headed. We're just trying to change the place where our electrons come from. And instead of them coming from Saudi Arabia and the Koch brothers, they can come from down the street or up the mountain. And if they do, then the world spins on, and we get the chance to keep working on all the other, in the end, in a sense, more interesting problems that human beings face.
So let's go back to that march that happened in New York, which you helped organize. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world marched on that day during the meeting with the UN. What was the impact? Was there an impact of this march? Do these marches get the people in power to listen? Are they getting the message?
Well, let's hope. I mean, no one march turns the tide, but this one actually seemed to do better than most. It was a couple of days later that Barack Obama, who really hasn't been much on climate stuff, addressed the UN and said, when people march in those kind of numbers, we have to listen. And it was a few weeks later that, pretty much to everyone's surprise, he announced this deal with the Chinese. Now, not a world-saving deal, but they each went further than they'd gone in the past. We'll see. A good test for this year will be if President Obama is able to keep the faith and block the Keystone Pipeline, or whether he gives in to the Koch brothers on it. People have marched about that in record numbers. Let's hope that it has the effect it needs to.
You mentioned that U.S.-China climate agreement. What do we know about that so far? I heard, I think it was Noam Chomsky said that, we don't know enough about it yet to know for sure if it's a good thing, because it may actually, given that it's an agreement between these two countries, it might inadvertently or intentionally undermine the ability to reach global agreements
I think the biggest problem with it is it's essentially an IOU written on the future, and Obama can't make good his end of it. It's a kind of, it'll depend on who the next three presidents are, what they do, and so in that way it's more a promissory note than it is a deal. That's where we are. And I'm false optimism has never been my problem. I wrote the first book about all this global warming stuff 25 years ago this year, and its cheerful title was The End of Nature. So I'm not prone to any Pollyanna-ish views, and I don't take one on this, except to say that it's a good sign that the pushing that people are doing is beginning to be felt, and if we push harder, it'll be felt more.
So back to Obama for a moment. When he secured the Democratic nomination in 2008, he had this sort of much ballyhooed quote. He said, "I am absolutely certain that generations from now we will be able to look back and tell our children this was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal." Has he delivered on that promise?
Well, the rise of the oceans has definitely not begun to slow. Look, that was a big promise. And no, he hasn't made climate change a central focus of his work yet. Let's hope that in the last 2 years he manages to do something. He won't get any help from Congress, and so there'll be limits to what he can do. But the things he can do, he needs to do. Ask me that question once we find out what he does about the Keystone Pipeline. Not that solves any of the world's problems, except that it would be the first time a world leader has said, here's a big project we're not going to build because of its effect on the climate. And that at least would give him some credibility on these issues as we head off to next year's big negotiations in Paris in December. We need those to go better than the last set in Copenhagen in 2009.
So what is your sense, if you have one, of why Obama hasn't placed the issue of climate change higher on his list of priorities?
Well, here's a good, I'm afraid this is the right place to end, because it brings us full circle back to your same question about Congress. Mm-hmm. Look, this is the richest industry in human history. That kind of money, I hope I'm not upsetting any of your listeners with my cynicism when I say that in our political system, money perhaps buys you more power than your arguments deserve. And that's true in the Oval Office just as it is in the Capitol building down the street. And so our only hope, since we're not going to match Exxon dollar for dollar, our only hope is to find a different currency to work in. That's the currency of movements, passion, spirit, creativity, all the things that have been on display this year as people around the world have really done epic work to build this movement. Let's hope it keeps building in 2015 and makes life harder for the 1% of the 1%.
Well, thank you, Bill, for taking time out of your day to speak with me. And I want to, on behalf of all of my listeners, sincerely thank you for the great work and advocacy that you've been doing for decades now. It's incredibly valuable. And maybe we can just leave with the final question of where would you have listeners go, or what would you have them do to contribute to this fight?
Well, look, some of the work you got to do is local to get all your places, beginning to move in the right direction. And there's obviously a lot of work to do in a place like Maine. But we need you to save some of your energy for the national and global fight, too. And I think 350.org has kind of emerged as the clearinghouse for a lot of that coordination of this resistance as it spreads around the world. So that's as good a place as any to look. Hopefully, you won't have to look too hard. Hopefully, we'll be making enough noise that it'll be kind of noticeable, and everyone will join in. There's been amazing advocacy in Maine. We're so grateful for that pipeline victory in Portland. We got to build on that, go on the offense, and really change this dynamic. and change it fast, because this is not like other fights. If we don't win quickly, then we don't win. That's what the physics tells us. So our work is cut out, but we're in a better place than we were a year ago. So that's good.
Okay, well, thank you again, Bill McKibben. Thanks for coming on the Soapbox.
My pleasure. God bless, Eric. Take care.
You too.